Hi, everyone. It's Alec Crawford, your host for the AI Risk Reward podcast. And our very special guest today is Shiva Rajgopal, professor at Columbia Business School. Welcome, Shiva.
Hey, Alec. Hope to have some fun today.
We're going to have some fun for sure. And we're going to kick it off with look, you're a professor at Columbia Business School, but like not forever. So you must have done something before that. So talk to us a little bit about your first job.
First job. Okay, so I'm a chartered accountant from India, and we have something similar to a clerkship in the law group, for instance. So I started working when I was, I'm forgetting, maybe not even legally eligible to work or something, 16. So I finished my CA in 2.5, 3 years. So literally my first job was 2 years with a CA firm in India. We call them CAs. You guys call them CPAs. The third year of that stint was with Procter and Gamble
Hmm.
in India, and then I formally worked for 3 years with Citibank in India and Singapore before I got a PhD and get a PhD, and I've been in academia since. So
Wow. Well,
as I
that's pretty
joke,
cool.
before I got into the priesthood.
So, any good stories at all from when you were living in India and working? I mean, obviously, it's very different than living and working in New
That's
York City.
very different times as well. I mean, this was late 80s, early 90s is when I left. So I left in 92 and I've been in the US since, which is forgetting if I can do the math. I'm just an accounting professor. Yeah, 32 years. So I've spent more of my life here than in India. But I, of course, go back often. I'm quite connected to the country. Very different place. Very different place. Obviously, the India I left had was didn't have as much hope as it does today. In the sense, I'll give you the background. We had like 6 weeks of foreign currency left to pay for imports. There's some bizarre horror stories. I didn't have enough foreign currency. Frankly, not even enough money, but not even enough foreign currency to pay for the GMAT exam, to pay for admissions to colleges in the US. I would write to them saying, "My country has no currency. Please be kind to me and waive the admission fee." And frankly, many of them did.
That's great.
So, you know, but things are super different now. I just got back a couple of weeks back. Uh, the stock market is at some insane high in Bombay. So much money, especially private equity money, chasing companies. It's a completely different world.
Yeah, different world. And speaking of your youth, you mentioned you read The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, and it had a big impact on you when you were younger. So pitch our audience on that book. Why should they read that book?
Well, I've read a lot, of course, but Fountainhead stood out because a lot of what we read in our textbooks and what we saw around us was India had something called a mixed economy, and the theory was that you get the best of both the private sector and the public sector. And tragically, at least in my time, in most cases, we got the disadvantages of both systems, but never the advantages. So I often joke, if our companies either delivered on mission or on profits, I'd be happy. Just one. It was hard to get anything. So the whole libertarian thinking, if you will, from Ayn Rand had a huge impact on me. It took me, I think I was probably a teen when I read that. It took me 2 years to shake the book off. I was trying to behave like, the engineer. I'm forgetting the protagonist's name. It's been such a long time back. Uh, it, you know, he was an amazing guy. And Ayn Rand, I know, is a controversial figure. I thought that was incredible, just getting exposed to a very different way of thinking, because that was very, very new to India. We didn't really have anything close
Oh
to a
yeah.
libertarian way of thinking. We have a robust private sector, but business was always viewed suspiciously because of the East India Company and how we got colonized for 200 plus years by the British. So, radically different way of thinking. It had a huge impact.
Super interesting. So, look, this show's about AI, and we talked a little bit before. And look, AI is going to revolutionize a lot of different things. And I'm curious, how has AI changed teaching, even for you today? What do you have to do differently, or what's good, what's bad?
I think it's such a game changer. I wrote a piece and I can forward that to you. And the opening line in that piece is that virtually 90% of what we teach in a business school can be sourced from AI. So it's
Wow.
as radically different as that. Why? Partly because a lot of it is a case-based way of teaching. You can get answers slash perspectives to virtually every HBS case, our business school case, I'm guessing, on ChatGPT. I tried a few. They were really good. Uh, well, since I teach accounting, valuation, fundamental analysis, maybe some of the numbers, which ChatGPT is not as good as at numbers as it can be, but that's just a matter of months, right? The O1 models or something, with Excel can now build those things in. Uh, it's actually it's asking hard questions that should have been asked many years back. How are we adding value as faculty? You know, uh, by and large, students can get a lot of the so-called rules, perspectives through podcasts, blogs. There's so many resources on the internet, right? So it has to be the human element, it has to be judgment, decision making, and the good old act of management. Because getting stuff done is hard, right? Proposing stuff is easy. How do you actually implement in many of these things? Bad boss, changing regulatory environments, supply chain problems, staff doesn't show up to work. So I guess it's a time for business schools to sit back and think about how can I add value beyond AI. And it's incredible in so many ways. For instance, the classic model was a pointy-headed smart person or whatever, the wise person may not be smart, may not even be wise, but they're supposed to lecture to a room, and then students kind of hang on to every word we say, take notes, and so on. All that's like completely gone, because virtually everything now is available online, especially through ChatGPT and other sources. You can get notes as though it's written for a eighth grader or a ninth grader or 10th grader or entering college level student. You can get answers to virtually every case out there. uh, it's hard to write exams which are low level exams, because ChatGPT easily gets through the CPA exam, for instance. uh, so what can you do? I mean, I've said, inject a whole bunch of practical applications into the program, make exams project based, not it can't be this one grand final exam at the end. It's not going to work. Can't really ban technology, so just get the elephant in the room out of the conversation, and just in fact give people a copy of what ChatGPT says about this particular problem or case. So you know
Yeah.
instead of worrying about policing them and are they cheating or not, it's like such a silly thing to do. Just go up the value chain, which is probably the general advice that one has to give, and probably implement in virtually every sphere of our lives. We have to go up the value chain. You know, the old cliche of man plus machine is better than man versus machine, because we can't win that battle.
Yeah. And look, it's going to change research as well, right? Like you've got the example, the cheating example, and there's other, more problematic examples where, I've heard of, for example, medical professionals who are from a different country, and, they normally basically write a sentence when, asked about, oh, how was the patient overnight? They write the patient was fine, right? And then at some point they start writing a couple of paragraphs in iambic pentameter about the patient. Pretty clearly, they didn't come up with that themselves, right? So,
That's a good
yeah, it could
point.
be problematic.
Hugely, and that's right. Trying to detect plagiarism, or at least plagiarism in a narrow sense, has this been done on ChatGPT? It's kind of pretty difficult. Might as well give up on that. Uh, yeah, so it's a whole new world. We need a version of the Turing test for the classroom, which we'll probably fail to come up with. So you have to almost assume that people are using AI, and come up with maybe assignments that help you critique what AI tells you. In fact, the way I think about this, it's actually not that difficult. There are three skills you need in a classroom. First, does the student understand what AI is telling the student? So the entry level core classes, whatever that they are, like econ, finance, accounting. I guess that's not going to change a whole lot because that's a way of introducing people to the vocabulary of the field, some basic framework, some basic ideas. So you still need that. Somebody, I mean, you can still get that on ChatGPT and so on, but it's perhaps useful for an instructor to vocalize this and for maybe students to have conversations around that. Stage two and stage three, meaning can you critique what AI is telling you and can you use AI as a force multiplier, is where the action really lies, because that's where teaching has to change. Um, and I'll give you an example. This is it. So I put in something saying Tesla is valued at like whatever 1.4 trillion. Seems a tad overvalued to me. Can you write me a case for if you're a short seller? And you know, ChatGPT did an absolutely superb job of kind of coming up with all the possible reasons why Tesla might be overvalued. Then I said, Tesla is actually perhaps a buy at 1.4 trillion. It sounds fantastic. There are huge prospects. Uh, and then it used the exact same arguments, but just twisted things around and maybe wrote a different spin on why maybe this is a buy. So this is an example of a case where the student needs to decide or a trader needs to decide what exactly is going on. The 10 factors you came up with are superb, very interesting, but this is where judgment comes in. So a lot of the early part of the value chain in the knowledge cycle will get commoditized. It's the higher end, whatever you want to call that, 10, 20, 30%, which is the most important 10, 20, 30% where a human being needs to get involved. That's what I mean by going up the value chain.
Yeah.
But it is a problem for anybody below that 10, 20, 30% in the knowledge value chain. What are we going to do with these people? Will they have jobs? And if they don't have jobs, is everybody going to get upskilled? If not, they're going to be very unhappy voters for a very long time, et cetera, things to worry about.
Yeah. Well, obviously the AI is getting better at working with numbers and logic with the recent model releases from OpenAI, for example. How good are companies at looking at? I'm sorry, how good is AI at like looking at balance sheets and income statements and things like that?
Not very good in my experience. It might get better for a couple of reasons. One, uh, it it is very good at regurgitating what's out there. It's I still think a lot of this is pattern recognition. There's not as much logical reasoning or prediction. Maybe that'll change over time. The second reason, the financial companies are pretty good at you know fencing their data off from OpenAI. So a lot of the data tends to be oldish, like 2, 3, 4 quarters old, which is not super useful if you're a trader or so on. From a classroom standpoint, maybe it's okay, but and that'll of course change. There'll be special purpose versions of these things for the financial markets. I know Bloomberg
Mhm.
has something, I believe, and the others will probably come up with one too. Uh, so as of now, I don't think it does a good job. And even before all this, Alec, I think so much of analysis has become commoditized. So if something's not on Bloomberg or Cap IQ, the new generation of folks, it doesn't even occur to them that they need to go beyond. So technology can create its own problems. It
Yeah.
blindsides people into somehow, it gives them a sense of omniscience, or this is all I need to know in this area. Big mistake. And that's where the value add comes in. Do
Yeah.
people understand business at a deep level? The economics hasn't changed much.
Yeah.
You
No,
still have to worry about how does the business make money. If it's revenue, is it quantity, price, currency? Where is, how big is the market? How feasible is the plan? Are there substitutes to the product? What is the price elasticity of demand? Those questions will remain, because that's eternal, right? That's how you make money. Has AI conquered all those open questions? Maybe not.
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe not. Yeah, look, we've in our system at AI Risk, we've connected into SEC Edgar, so you can actually pull
Mhm.
data directly from the SEC, whether it's quarterly filings or all the numbers in their database going back for decades. So that's pretty clean. But you're right. If you just go to search the web or whatever, you may not find the right stuff.
Well, it'll get there. It'll get there.
Yeah.
It's good at detecting patterns that we otherwise may not be able to. Scale is the thing that AI does very well. So if you're a quant, actually, here's an idea for you, right? I mean, so there are the quants who effectively run these 30,000-foot models, factor this, factor that. There's a whole conversation, as you know, about the factor zoo. There are far too many things loading. And then people like me do the micro level work. We go deep into companies. Maybe AI will bring these two perspectives closer. Maybe if the macro models start thinking more granularly about what are they actually measuring, because one of the strange, I mean, like the hubris of the macro researcher is whatever I can't explain must be noise. No, the action is in the noise. So the noise is what the micro people do. The idiosyncratic issues with companies, for instance. Maybe AI will bring the micro and the macro view of understanding the fundamentals of a business closer.
Yeah, and look, I think some of the big changes we had talked about earlier are really going to end up being about back office automation, right?
Oh yeah,
Like,
that's the company side as opposed to the investing side. That is huge. You're absolutely right. I think it's like there's a revolution in back office automation that's coming. Uh, and I'm already hearing reports. Many companies are either outsourcing things to like human AI, Costa Rica, Bangalore, India, or something, in their FP&A divisions, or automating things. For example, I'm on the board of a company which is selling some software that can create a 10K in 20 minutes. It used to take like 6 weeks with
wow,
Workiva and the
amazing.
others. It's incredible, and it's actually, if you look at the black box, it's not that difficult. And repeat that over and over again to virtually say every financial statement, the Qs, the proxy statement, the S1s, the S3s, and that's just the beginning. And then you can go beyond. Look at the whole application in the law world, for instance. A lot of the lawyers, unfortunately, charge $1,000 an hour for sending an email. Basically, the same contract, which is kind of a few
Yeah.
bespoke conditions changed here and there. That industry is in trouble. Uh, so many other things one can talk about. Lower level tax advice perhaps can be AI. You can get a nice chatbot to help you. It's quite good. I've tested that. It's not going to be very good in trying to advise you about, say, IP law in Cyprus, but the basic stuff, like maybe a very good version of TurboTax, which will give you some advice for maybe double the price. I think people will pay, right?
Yeah. What are some other things you use AI for?
I started using it for everything. You know, I'm just joking, but this is an interview at 4:30 in the evening. Motivate me to go and talk to Alec. Does a fabulous job giving a bunch of motivational, you know, uh, talking points, saying, "Oh, you should go. You'll have impact. You'll reach people." I'm just making something up, but that's an example. It's a very good low level motivator, counselor, tax consultant, so many other applications I can think of.
Yeah.
Coach, critic as well, or I mean, let's say you're interviewing for a job. Fire a bunch of questions that people will ask me. Does a pretty decent job at all that.
Yeah, that's
Very
cool.
impressive, really.
Are there any, besides the obvious tools, like we've mentioned ChatGPT a couple times, are there others that you've tried that you really like or?
That's I mean, I'm not as much of a power user as probably you are, and there's so many apps that are coming out. At some point I want to go create a list, at least for students in my class. um Not really. I mean, I've used the podcast. What is it, like Notebook LLM, which is again
Yeah, Notebook LM's kind of
scary,
cool.
scary, scary, scary. I don't know if you listen to the Bloomberg Odd Lots podcast. It sounds uncannily like those people.
Yeah,
It's a good
maybe
podcast.
they trained it on Bloomberg.
Well, I mean, the folks who run that podcast should listen. I'm sure they have, but
That's
it,
funny.
it it is scary good, scary good.
Yeah. What concerns do you have about AI at this point?
You know, so all I mean, I know there's a lot of hype, but it's an amazing machine and an amazing innovation, as we joked before. you almost don't need to hype it. Let people just use it and experiment it, because they'll come to their own conclusions, which will usually be pretty positive. The one worry I do have when it's about models in general, when companies use models and they're using it all the time, first of all, it's in sample. It's pattern recognition, not logical reasoning. That's something that people should hopefully understand. Second, the type 1, type 2 errors. I mean, the classic statistics, false positives and false negatives on predictive data, meaning when you apply it out of sample, not on the data on which it's been trained on, but outside of that. I think more needs to be done in terms of putting those numbers out, because whenever I've worked with these things, at least in my limited domain with financial statements and so on, it's not all that good. It's super sensitive to small changes. And before we start using these for decisions that matter to people's lives, and we've already started using them, right? Like recruiting, for instance. Uh, Upload a 90-second video clip and we will decide whether to interview you or not. Resumes. What are the type 1, type 2 errors on these decisions? I mean, insurance companies, before they decide to, pass or reject a claim, you're going to see more and more and more of these models. I think it's like a nutrition label. I worry the fights of tomorrow, the litigations of tomorrow is not going to be about contracts. It's going to be about algorithms,
Yeah.
especially the type 1, type 2 errors.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely, I mean, people talk about hallucinations and other problems with AI. It's just not quite there yet, and the problem may not come when AI is right 95% of the time, because we still look at the answers and go, yeah, that's wrong. It's going to come when it's right 99% of the time, and then that 1% we're like, oh, that doesn't look great, but I'm just going to trust the AI, right? And then,
It's
oops, you've got a
it's a
problem.
great point. And an application that comes to mind is auditing. All of auditing is about creating an audit trail. Can I trace this back to the source document? And AI is not good at that, right? So when will the regulators be happy with letting audit firms use AI to do audits? At what stage are you willing to not live with complete traceability, but the upside being you don't have to do sampling anymore. You can look at the entire distribution of the entire population. Does that lead to cheaper, better, lower cost audits? Which raises other arguably disconcerting questions. If that is the case, if these are information businesses, is there a case to be made to let maybe information businesses do audits? Should we have
Wow.
Microsoft? And I mean, why
Wow.
not? It's the same thing, right? Amazon, Microsoft,
Yeah.
as long as they have the reputational capital, the financial capital, it's probably a heretical. I mean,
Yeah. The big
it's
four are
stuff the
quaking
big
in their
four will
boots
not
now.
like what I'm saying, but it's. I'm sure they're thinking about this,
Yeah.
because you want to compete beyond simply a regulatory barrier, right? You want to do the best audits, not because you have the license to do them.
Yeah. And so you've got a lot of students, obviously, and some of them are using AI in the class and not. And
All of them are.
what kinds of things are they bringing up in class about AI?
All of them are. They are trying to sound smarter than they are, which is an endemic problem with MBA students. You very rarely meet MBAs who will say, I don't know. And AI has made that worse. But do they fully understand what they are reading? Can they fully critique what they are reading? Maybe not. We're still in an experimental stage, I would argue. And I think Colombia is frankly far ahead of the others, because our dean just did something very smart. So we give out iPads to everybody who comes in with notes and so on, so we don't have to keep printing reams of paper. Everybody gets access to the latest version of ChatGPT 4 and beyond. So this takes the faculty, in some sense, out of the conversation. It's like permissionless innovation. Now you have to go figure out how you're going to add value in a class beyond. But students have all the tools, right?
Yeah.
So we are past this world of, oh, are you using it or not? No, everybody's using it. So it's add
Super
value
smart.
beyond.
Other schools have banned it, and
I think
it's
it's
just not
such
going
a
to work.
mistake. It's such a mistake.
It's
I
not going to
I
work.
really worry about the undergraduate programs. For the longest time, at least the way accounting was taught, was you just basically teach people rules. Now, it's important to teach people rules, but not to kind of use 4 years of your life learning rules. and you can get all that to some extent from ChatGPT. You might not get the nuanced things, this nth financial engineering on a stock option. How should I account for that? Okay, that might be hard,
Yeah.
but we need to have a conversation. You need a fundamental rethink of that
Yeah.
model.
Well, you can't get an MBA from Columbia Business School from ChatGPT, but apparently you can learn a lot of the information, is what you're saying.
Well, as a debating point to have a provocative conversation, yes, but a lot of learning is social. That's what we
Mm,
discovered during COVID. The students were harassing us to come back in person, and we discovered so they can hang out with one another, not because they wanted to hang out with faculty, but but it does emphasize the value that how big the social element of learning really is. It's mostly the commitment. I mean, you've seen this with the so-called MOOCs, these large platform models, where a lot of people sign up to a class, very few finish. So
mm,
just the commitment of showing up, partly because you owe some psychological debt, perhaps in a bizarre manner, to the instructor or to your teammates, and that commitment actually helps you finish the
interesting.
program. So finishing is a huge problem when it's all completely disintermediated by technology. So you need that social glue. And frankly, why do people come to business school? I think it's three things. It's knowledge, it's network, and a platform. You can get the knowledge from ChatGPT and so on, but you won't get the platform and the network. So I'm not worried about the future of
Yeah.
business schools or anything like that.
Neither am I. Yeah.
We just have to change the way we do things, though, to be frank.
Yeah. And look, to the extent that business schools are, to some degree focused on entrepreneurship, depending on where you are, like, yeah, that is obviously very complex and requires a lot of different skills, many of
Well,
which you're
let me
not
add one
learning
more
from
element.
ChatGPT.
Yeah, I often tell people, look around you. Right, we are surrounded by mismanagement. How can there how can there ever be a problem with management schools? Our garbage doesn't get picked up. We're not happy with our schools. Subways don't run on time, etc., etc. So there's a huge demand for better management practices. uh, we of course have to change how we deliver things and what we study and what we do research on and what we disseminate in a classroom. But the the institution of a management school probably has a very bright future, because
Yeah.
we've not even solved the basic problems of poor management,
Yeah.
both in the public and the private sector.
That's pretty funny. Yeah. So I sit on the executive committee of the Global AI Ethics Institute. And one of the things that we think about is, look, it's pretty clear tons of AI stuff going on here in the US, and China's doing their thing and maybe a little bit in Europe, but a lot of other countries are going to have to kind of race to catch up. And this could also create some ethical quandaries at some point, right? Like,
Oh, huge.
okay, if you're in the US and your call center is in another country and now I can save money by having an AI call center, like, guess what? People in a different country might be out of work. So how should we think about that
I'll
problem?
well, that's a good question, and let me give you a story, which is even more edgy, if you will. So I think somebody now is selling a software where you can have a call center employee sitting in Bangalore, India, but you can make them sound like anybody. You can give them a Welsh accent, you can give them a Scottish accent, you can give them a Spanish accent, you can give them a whatever accent, because it's trivial, frankly, to kind of use the technology and filter that out. That is interesting. On the one hand, it's super efficient, but it also makes us ethnocentric. The genius of New York is that everybody has an accent. Uh, well, most
Yeah.
people do. But you get my point. That's an example, I think, of what you're saying, and that's going
Yeah.
to happen at some point. How do you deal with it? Governance is a huge factor. I mean, even now, do we really have a good handle on how to govern social media, how to govern data privacy? No, it's only going to get worse with AI. Uh, it's an interesting thing to worry about. This whole responsible AI, ESG of today will probably become responsible AI. That'll become the big thing tomorrow. Climate, of course, is always going to be a concern. But how do you substitute labor with capital? At what point is it appropriate? What are we going to do with the labor? Should we start taxing robots? Who's going to keep an eye on AI? How much should we trust governments to govern all this?
Yeah.
Does self-governance work? Is the Facebook system, the ombudsman, whatever, is that effective? Big
Yeah.
questions.
It's a long, long list. Yeah. A
Yeah.
lot of tough questions without obvious answers. So, turning to our advice section here, look, you've been in finance and accounting a long time at a prestigious school, and I'm sure a lot of your former students are now CFOs out there. And what's your advice, or what do you hear about in terms of advice for CFOs about using AI? What can they do today? What should they be looking at for the future, and what should they be cautious about?
As we touched on earlier, the back office, sadly, is probably just going to go. Sadly for the people working there, I mean, the CFO's job is not going to shrink. If anything, it's become bigger. The old cliche of technology eats everything. You can actually see this in the data. So the SEC requires that if you're a public company, you disclose the compensation of the top 5 officers. You know that. So if you go back in history, not even like ancient history, I think the data started in '92. Used to see a lot of marketing people in the top 5 most compensated. And in the last 10 years, all the marketing jobs from the top 5 have disappeared. This is an example of technology eating everything. Technology is eating marketing. It's now become a tech job. Of course, there are the creative people, the people who write copy, but all that's also probably going to go away with AI. Will that happen to finance? No. If anything, the CFO's jobs actually become bigger. They've become close to co-CEOs. Maybe my hope is that the classic scientific management type techniques, meaning evidence-based thinking, less gut feel. I'm not saying you shouldn't have gut feel, but more data-driven uh, scenario planning, more data-driven analysis in general of postmortems of where did things go wrong in an acquisition versus not. What portion of our R&D is actually firing? Can we reduce the extent of waste in general? All that will actually just improve over time. So if anything, the CFO's job is going to get more evidence based, better, more productive. Now, of course, this opens social questions that I worry about. What happens to these displaced people? Is everybody ready to go up the value chain? Are our educational institutions even close to ready in trying to train the workforce for tomorrow? Banning AI is like such a silly thing to do. It's just a way to preserve the jobs of teachers and so on in the short run at the cost of hurting the next generation of students that we are trying to train. Lots of the whole value chain of producing human capital has to be looked at carefully.
Yeah. Well, look, I think especially in the US, many prospective students are focused much more on return on investment, really looking at college as an investment, business school as an investment. So pitch your future student that's thinking about coming to Columbia Business School. Like, what's the ROI there, right? And you talked about
Yeah,
the different
I've always,
factors
that's a
before.
good question, and there's so much hand wringing in the Wall Street Journal and so on about what's the ROI to an MBA. I find the whole thing, borderline puerile. I'll tell you why. And this is probably because we are very, very spoiled in a very bad way because we live in New York City. You know, Daycare in New York is like $40,000. You're probably paying slightly more than what you pay for daycare to go to to go to Columbia Business School. So that's argument number one. Two, it's hugely accretive in the long run. Again, even if you forget all the knowledge we gave you, which you probably will forget at some point, you took some principles out, you took some way of thinking back, but it gave you the network and the platform. You know, even today, the higher end jobs are not the jobs you interview for. These are jobs that somebody calls to nominate you. And how's that going to happen? Unless you have a network and a platform. Sadly, uh, we tend to hire people who we know because the information asymmetry is too high. And who do you usually call? People you went to school with, people you hung out with, people you had a nice time when you were 19 getting drunk somewhere, because it's there's this implicit understanding, right, with these people. And it's probably no accident that your dorm mate becomes a CEO and then calls you to go join their startup. Now, is that completely equitable and egalitarian? No. But this whole idea of you know, I challenge you to find me, you know, any n number of students from Columbia Business School who don't think that they got their value for money 5 years out or 10 years out. I think
Yeah.
it'll be zero. Seriously, because it's not such a large number. Going back to our daycare example,
Yeah. I know.
or,
Well, New
or
York
or
is
private
crazy.
school. How much do we? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not
It's
trying to
all
be
crazy. It's all crazy in New
elitist or
York.
privileged or whatever, but private school in New York is like $60,000.
Yeah.
What do we charge? Slightly more
Yeah.
for graduate education. It's actually a bargain. And there's another element that sometimes students don't understand, we don't often discuss. Our cost structure might be like 2x higher than, say, Yale or Cornell because we are in the city. We can't
Right.
charge 2x more.
Yeah. That's fair.
So they are getting subsidies from grants, donations, a bunch of other things. Yeah.
Yeah. So the last 5 minutes is a lightning round where I mention different things, Shiva, and ask if you think they're underrated or overrated and why. And since you live in New York, I'm going to kick it off with Broadway musicals, underrated or overrated.
I would say hugely overrated. If people want to watch something close to a Broadway musical and want to have 10 times more fun, go watch a good Bollywood movie.
Playing chess, underrated or overrated?
Underrated. I think I love playing chess. I'm not claiming that it made me smarter or anything like that, but it did improve visual cues. It did improve game theory. It was elementary game theory. Even before we read it in textbooks with math and symbols, it was a way of thinking about what would your opponent strategically do. And sometimes the smarter people think 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 moves ahead. Uh, Underrated. And I should add another plug. The world chess championship title is now held by an Indian. So.
There you go. All right, we'll go to the other end of the spectrum. Bird watching, underrated or overrated?
Underrated. I absolutely love bird watching. I don't have the time to do it anymore. Plus, I'm too lazy to go out at 4 in the morning in New York winters. Highly underrated. I think a lot of my things that we didn't touch on. A lot of my other work deals with sustainability and so on. Uh, if people just got out of their offices, and it's a massive stress buster. B, it gives you a sense of you know perspective. Sometimes we get too caught up in our narrow fights because there's a
Yeah.
whole big world out there, and it gives you some perspective about life in general.
All right, prospects for cricket in the US,
Ah,
underrated or overrated?
I'm a huge cricket fan. Overrated. I mean, at the end of the day, it's I've lived here 30 plus years, as we discussed. I still can't get into baseball. I think baseball's like a bad version of cricket. Having said that, it's a very British game. It's more about process. It is less about outcome. Of course, now they've crunched it and they've tried to make it like baseball, and they have cheerleaders and all that. But I prefer the old version. Uh, Maybe the world needs a little more process and a little less outcome orientation.
Yeah, there we
But
go.
that probably won't happen in the US because it's a very different
Yeah,
place.
unlikely. Uh, Playing bridge, underrated or overrated?
Good point. I don't know how to play bridge.
All right,
So
so
at
we don't
best,
know.
I've played rummy and things
Yeah,
like that. But some of the very smart traders seem to be bridge players. So I'm sure
yeah,
there's something there.
a lot of memorization and stuff. The book, The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham,
Ah,
underrated or overrated?
underrated. Everybody should read it. The principles have not changed. Of course, does anybody find market to book less than one stocks anymore? No. The so-called cigar butts and all that. But the way of thinking, the discipline, the rigor of actually going and looking at arcane sources of information, like railway commission records and so on. Some of the modern analysts can use that a bit more. This kind of goes back to our earlier conversation. Think beyond Bloomberg, CapIQ, and FactSet. There's a lot
Yeah,
of other information to be had. What happened to good old analysis, where you actually go talk to people, talk to suppliers, customers? We don't do a lot of that anymore. That's the downside to the impression that everything we want to know is on the web or on
Yeah,
ChatGPT.
I'm going to break in and give two examples of things around that because I think it's such an important theme if you're an investor. Um, One is, obviously quality of management. Like that doesn't show up in the numbers necessarily, especially for a relatively young company. For example, when Steve Jobs went back to work at Apple, like that didn't show up in the numbers for a while, right? But many people looked at that and said, "He's back. I'm buying. I'm in." Right. So
And that's
that's
what a VC does. I mean, who really buys your business plan? They're buying you, the entrepreneur.
right. And the other thing, which is right up your alley, is accounting changes, right? So I remember this great story. It was more than 10 years ago, but Apple had a bunch of iPhones on installment plans, and they were basically accruing that income as it came in. And the IRS came to them and said, no, no, you have to recognize all that income on the sale date of the phone. It doesn't
Mm,
matter if they paid you cash or you're getting paid over 3 years. And I looked at that and said, I'm going to buy Apple
mm.
because
Because they're too conservative, if anything.
right, because
Yeah,
what's going to
exactly.
happen is that optically their PE is going to drop because of this accounting change. And that's exactly what happened. And then everybody kind of forgot about it, and the P just went back to where it was, and the stock went up, 20% just on a baseline on an accounting change. So that was kind of funny. Anyway, so moving on. Uh,
Something that AI still can't detect, by the way.
right, that's my point too. Uh, Diwali celebrations in the U.S. underrated or overrated?
Celebrations in the US. The part with fireworks, I love. July 4th and so on. Why? Because there's an Indian festival called Diwali.
Hmm.
That was the only thing I really missed when I migrated. I still love fireworks. Of course, now because of pollution and so on, you don't get as many.
Yeah.
Uh,
So Diwali in the U.S. How's is that underrated or
well,
overrated?
that's my July 4th.
Yeah.
Because it's still complicated here because of fire code and so on, right? You
Mm.
can't really, you need too many permissions to actually
Do it
use
correctly.
fireworks. Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair enough. New York City bagels, underrated or overrated?
I have a bit of a gluten allergy. So,
Ah,
but having said that, gluten free bagels, they're very good,
oh,
underrated.
that's
Yeah.
good. I need to recommend. How about a location for gluten-free bagels in New York?
That's a good question. There's a place close to NYU.
Mm,
I'm kind of blanking on the name.
yeah.
NYU does have better restaurants than we do, but we're better faculty. So,
And last but not least, the Bollywood movie Delhi Belly, underrated or overrated?
highly underrated. Most people don't appreciate the movie. It's almost not made for arguably mainstream Indian sensibilities, maybe.
Hmm.
So it's not like a classic quote unquote what we call a masala movie where there are like 7 songs and fight sequences, which I enjoy, and I'm not, you know, um, it's just a different movie. Delhi Belly is a cult classic.
Yeah,
Probably,
I'm going to watch it this weekend. That sounds great.
yeah, it should be on Netflix or Prime.
I'll
It's
track it
uh,
down.
it's a fun, yeah. It captures the Delhi culture, and I'm not from Delhi. I'm from Bombay. India is effectively a continent, by the way. It's like so different. Virtually every state is different. We have like 70 plus languages. Uh, the West usually thinks of India as maybe Bollywood and cricket, which is fine. Yeah, but it's a very complicated place. So this movie picks up the culture in Delhi, which is very different from Bombay, which is where I grew up, which is where the word Bollywood actually comes from, which is B for Bombay.
Awesome.
But consider watching it. If you don't like it, I'll give you other names.
I'll get a refund. All right. So thanks for coming to the show. This has been Shiva Rajgopal, professor at Columbia Business School. It's great to have you here. Thanks for coming to the show, Shiva.
Thank you so very much, Alec. This was fun.